değerli meslektaşlarımız, bilim insanları, değerli dostlar. Bugün el yazmaları, kitap sanatı ve hat salonlarımızın açılışının hemen ertesinde böyle bir toplantıya ev sahipliği yapmaktan onur duyuyoruz. Eski dostumuz, meslektaşımız Francois Deroche'un, Profesör Francois Deroche da burada konuşmacı ve sizlerle birlikte bu seminerik yapacak olmamızdan da müthiş bir gurur duyuyoruz, sevinç duyuyoruz efendim. Hocamızın özgeçmişi dağıtıldı size, onunla zaman kaybetmeyeyim. Öyle zannediyorum ki sözü ona bırakmak en doğrusu. Bu çalışmayı planlayan Profesör Zeren Tanındı'ya ve bizim hat koleksiyonumuzun yöneticisi Ayşe Aldemir'e teşekkür borçluyum. Onu da bu arada söyleyeyim. Zeren Hanım'ın titiz çalışması ve bilim dünyasının her yanını kapsayan disiplinli tavrı olmasaydı da bunu yapamazdık. Onun için de kendisine gerçekten çok teşekkür borçluyum. Hoş geldiniz. İyi çalışmalar efendim. Çok teşekkür geldiğiniz için sevgili dostlar.
Çok teşekkürler. Kusura bakmayınız çünkü bugün İngilizce konuşacağım çünkü teknik kelimeler pek çok bilmiyorum. Bunun için İngilizceden Türkçe'ye bir tercüme olacak. Herhalde sorun varsa cevap Türkçe'de vereceğim. This will be a kind of open talk because of course it's impossible to go through every aspect of codicology within the time we have today, and I had to select some items. I shall also try to adjust to your own requirements because you may have some points which are of interest to you. And well, I suggest I will give an introduction to the topic, and then I suggest to speak a bit about paper, because it may be helpful if you don't have any idea. If you know everything about paper, I will skip it and jump to the next thing. But of course, this will depend on you. I will, please tell me if you are interested or not in those topics. So let's turn to codicology, which is a new approach, not so new because now it has some age, but it's comparatively new in comparison with art history or the fields of research which have a lot of bibliography. What is codicology? The name itself has to do with the book. It is the science of a specific kind of book, because before reaching the moment when mankind used the codex form, the codex shape of book, other books of course were known as the volumen, the book of the antiquity, which is used by the children in the middle, which disappeared almost completely except for some extraordinary situation like the Torah of the Jews, which is still today used in this way. It's a book which has two drawbacks. One is that when you want to see something at the end of the roll, you have to unroll the whole scroll in order to see it. And the other thing is that it's only written on one side. So you lose a lot of space. And I will speak about times when parchment or paper were expensive commodities. So people couldn't afford to spend too much in buying these and try to spare the material as far as possible. There is another kind of roll which is present in Islamic tradition. It's called technically rotulus. It's not used like the volumen has a roll with vertical columns, which one is reading one after the other, but you have to unroll it and look at the text going down until the end of the roll. But of course, this kind of book is not really in use for reading. It's more for talismanic purposes that it was produced in the past. The Codex is the shape of the book we know today. It looks basically like that. It may have some specific details which vary from one place to another, but in the end it has this shape. It is made of pages of paper or parchment which are arranged in a specific way, we shall see that later, and bound together by the back. The elements are to be used on both sides. We speak of folios where we are dealing with a single sheet, and a page if we are looking at one side or the other. Of course, there are imitations of codices. The Codex basically is produced with sheets of parchment or paper which are folded into two and then sewn together in order to produce quires and then a whole book. You know, of course, this kind of paperback which looks like a codex, but actually paper is no longer folded, it's just glued together by the back. And you know by experience that when using this kind of book during a long period of time, in the end it turns out into sheets of paper which are impossible to keep together. Other imitations of the Codex are known, like these famous early Quranic manuscripts, which are not codices strictly speaking, because once again it's a kind of pile of parchment pages which were held together by the back, but there was no fold. Another imitation of Codex is the papillon-like, the accordion-like book, which is known to people who are working with, let's say, calligraphic material or illumination or miniatures. It is not meant to be used like the Codex, but open in a different way with sheets which are held together by hinges which allow to look through the material, but of course it's only outside that it looks like a codex. Well, codicology is not dealing with any kind of book. We are dealing mainly with manuscripts. Manuscripts are, of course, in being for a long time, but the consciousness of the specificity of the manuscript arose when the printing press started to exist. The word manuscript in Western languages appears in the 16th century, when there is the need for a word to speak of those books in contradistinction to the printed book, which started its life and is still alive today. What is a manuscript? It's not a document, that is to say, it's not a material which is kept in archives, it's kept in libraries, and it doesn't cover this kind of situation. Here you have a marriage contract from Northern Africa written on parchment. It's a sheet of parchment, it's not a codex, and it's the topic of another field of research, diplomatics, which is the study of this kind of material. Manuscripts, of course, the word could be applied to this because it's written by hand, and in the end, when you speak of manuscript or Yazmal essay, you are speaking of something which is written by hand, and this is written by hand, but it has nothing to do with the Codex. This has to do with the Codex. It's a manuscript in its shape, but of course it's exactly the kind of thing you have in front of you while taking notes. It's a collection of pages which can be considered as a manuscript, but actually this is more a document or a collection of short text than a manuscript. When we are speaking about manuscript, we are more speaking of books which were produced to be used by many people and to be reproduced and again over a long period of time. Of course, there are, as in modern printing, there are successes and flops. There are manuscripts which exist in large numbers, like for the Dalail al-Khairat, which were very successful text from the 14th century, which has been written from Morocco to Indonesia by hand. And there are, of course, flops, that is to say, the text of an author who writes by himself the text on a manuscript, but nobody cares about it, and it doesn't turn into a book which is reproduced. Of course, this doesn't cover the situation when there is only one written witness of a text which may have been a success, and unfortunately all other copies disappeared and we only know a copy of it. Manuscripts are more looking like that. The difference between this and the previous one is that the project of a book doesn't exist as such. Here you have the plan of something which will be repeated from one page to the next one. On my previous slide, it's just haphazard on any page, written in any direction without any care for the future reader, because in the end, the owner of this book only thought of himself as a reader. Here we have a book which is produced for someone who will not have to make many efforts to read it. What are the goals of codicology? Of course, it's nice to look at manuscripts, but you have to do this for something. Basically, codicology has to answer a few questions. When was the manuscript produced? Where was it produced? Who produced it? And for whom? Very basic question, very simple questions, but we will see that they are not so easy to answer. In the Western field of research, there is a distinction, a very strong distinction between codicology and paleography. Because paleography appeared in the field of Western manuscript as early as the 17th century. In the field of Islamic manuscripts, there is no paleography as such. Of course, there are some attempts at paleography, but we don't have the body of knowledge which is typical of Latin or Greek manuscripts. So it has been my suggestion not to study separately the script and the manuscript. It's a little bit factitious to say, well, I look at the materials and you look at the script. I think it's, since we are at the beginning of a new field of research, it's worthwhile to have a look at both at the same time. Codicology has to answer the four basic questions I mentioned, and of course these are the basics of what one could call an archaeology of the book. It's a definition which has been given very commonly of codicology. So, like archaeologists, we have to look closely at the material, go through the pages of the book in search of elements to answer the questions. But, of course, looking at the manuscripts is not sufficient, because manuscripts are only understood if they are seen as a group, as a series. The isolated manuscript is always tricky, because it may give you hints which will prove not to be true or not to be understood properly. It's usually better to work on groups of manuscripts which were produced at some moment by in the same region, or manuscript of the a text which has been transcribed during centuries, so that you can compare things and understand how things came out. And we have plenty of examples of mistakes of understanding just due to the fact that people approached a manuscript as an isolated item, a kind of UFO fallen from nowhere, and looked at that without consideration for its environment. Once we start to look at manuscripts as a group, as a series, of course, we start immediately to go into the next step, that is to say, the history of the book. The history of the book, once again, is a new field of research which developed officially for the printed book in the 50s of the last century in Europe, and has been mainly represented in that field. But when we are doing codicology in the proper sense, we are collecting materials to understand the history of the book in the Islamic world, a topic which is up to this day only rarely envisioned. And it's important because the route for the history of the book, be it for printed books of Western Europe or Islamic manuscripts, is just the constatation that in the end people care for a very little amount of books, and we have in libraries large amounts of books which nobody will look at because they are not nice, they are not interesting for their text, they are not so and so. And it's like an iceberg. You look at the tip, 5%, and you forget the 95% of other manuscripts which can give you some more information about a culture, a civilization which developed over centuries and produced a huge amount of books. Because you have to remember that when speaking of Islamic manuscripts, we are dealing with incredible numbers of manuscripts. We are speaking of millions. Think that a colleague of mine, a specialist of Hebrew codicology, could tell me, I've seen all the Hebrew manuscripts in the world, because there are only a few thousands. So it's possible to go in the few libraries where these manuscripts are kept and see them. For Greek manuscript, it's a little bit more difficult. There must be between 80,000 and 100,000 Greek manuscripts of classical text. When you are dealing, as we do, with millions of manuscripts, it's just impossible. You know from the start that you will never be able to know the field in its entirety. You will be able to deal with a period or a place, but you will never cover all the field. And every time I go into a library, I discover new things. And well, if you continue working in this field, it will happen that you will discover that there are many things that were never mentioned, even in the books which are supposed to be the key to the understanding of codicology. A last point, codicology is important for cataloging. very often when you look at catalogs of manuscripts, and it was done like that. Nobody cared about the materials of the book. When you look at catalogs, you discover that there is almost nothing about the book itself. You will usually find the name of the author, the title of the text, eventually the date, perhaps the material, the number of pages, the size, but there is a wealth of information which is not present in manuscript. And codicology is precisely the tool for producing good descriptions of manuscript, which are important because in many instances this is the thing which you will use for your research, and in some cases it will be what will remain of a manuscript which disappeared. Think of a library in Sarajevo. We only of its manuscripts through the catalogs which in this case were present, but they are disappeared. And the same applies to another library in Spain, the library of the Escorial. Part of the library was burned by the fire in the 17th century, but still people who study Greek manuscripts have the description of the Greek manuscript which were burned during the fire, and this thanks to the catalog. So if the description is good, you will still have some information. If it's bad, you will miss a lot of things. The methods and tools of codicology. Well, first one, observation. You have to look at the manuscripts. Be aware that this is supposed to look carefully and many times to the same manuscript in order to discover everything he has to tell you. Importance of series, as I said previously, when you are dealing with an isolated manuscript, you have to be very careful because you may misunderstand completely what it means. It happened to a colleague of mine who published a very nice paper about Quranic manuscripts kept in Tunis, and came to the conclusion that there was some hidden structure in the text of the Quran itself, because he didn't understand that it was part of a group of manuscripts which had its roots in Ottoman Turkey, and that it was imported to Tunis by someone, we don't know whom, and transcribed into the typical script of Tunisia in the 19th century. But of course, if you take it separately, you don't understand anything. If you put it into its context, then it starts to tell a very complicated story. In some cases, eyes are not sufficient. Of course, you can observe a lot of things with your own eyes. But at some moment, you may have questions about, let's say, the workshop where the illuminations were produced. Until a recent date, it was almost impossible to say, for example, whether this blue was from lapis lazuli, from indigo. Well, lapis lazuli, you can recognize it, but well, let's take the yellows, it's more tricky. It was impossible to decide. We are fortunate today to have techniques which are available and not too expensive, which do not harm the book, which will allow you to know whether the yellow was from this origin or from that one. It's also useful for dating purposes. In some cases, the C14 technique, which now requires very little material. Think that 30 years ago, you needed half a page of a manuscript. Now, you even don't need the half of my fingernail to make an analysis of the date. So even a librarian may allow you to take a thin strip of paper or parchment in order to make this analysis. This was not thinkable a short time ago. Now it is possible, and it's in some cases it's very helpful to solve some datation questions which are very thorny. And in the end, of course, you have to go for the bibliography. Know the catalogs, know the books which will give you information about the manuscripts produced in the Islamic world. Well, I will make a short advertisement page for a book on codicology which exists in English version, and hopefully is available. So it's not the last word. It's a first tone about codicology, but there are a lot of things which are missing, of course. For example, to take only an example, there is not a single word about the manuscripts produced in Spain, in Muslim Spain in the 16th century. Well, and it's only an example. You have this homemade publication, which is a kind of album of paleography and codicology, which has been produced until recently, and for the moment it's interrupted. It's the largest album series we have to date, with on one side the description of the manuscript, and on the other side the picture of the one page of the manuscript, and above all the picture of the colophon of the manuscript, that is to say the central information about the manuscripts. Recently, Adam Gacek has published this very nice book, which is very useful because it's alphabetically ordered, and you will find a lot of information and examples taken from manuscripts. It's really very, very useful. So you have to use this and a lot of patience, because, of course, things do not happen all of a sudden. You have to get some experience, look at the books, and I will tell you a history which happened to me in this city when I started many years ago. I was working on manuscripts in the Topkapi Saray library, written on parchment, and I've seen that manuscript 2 or 3 times, and I came again. It was in winter, and it was the last manuscript I saw that day. The sun was about to disappear, and there was a very low light coming from the window of the library, and this light came just on the first page, and I saw that there was a text which has been erased, which I never noticed before, because the light in the, well, I will say that the light in the library is not exactly the best one, because it comes from electric bulbs, which, well, in that time, which are not very nice, and I just didn't see the text until that day. So patience is a very important ingredient of the work of the codicologist. So with these few words, I conclude this introduction, and if you don't have any question, I will go to paper, if you are interested in paper. Yes? Okay. So you know that paper has been known for a long time in the Islamic world. There is even a specific date for its introduction. It's very easy, 750, the Battle of Talas in Central Asia, where Muslim troops defeated the army of Prince of Fergana, which was allied, allied with the Chinese emperor, and so says the history. He had some Chinese in his troops who were taken prisoner, and it happens that these prisoners knew how to produce paper, and they were transferred to Samarkand and started to make paper for their new masters. So it's a very nice history, because we know almost precisely when paper came into the Islamic world. Actually, things are not so simple, because you see this document, which is written on paper, was found close to Samarkand in the 30s of the last century. They are the archive of a king of this region, and this man was exchanging letters with the Muslim governor of Samarkand before 750, and he wrote on paper. And more important, the Arab governor of Samarkand was also writing on paper. So paper was known before that. It was probably imported from China and known in this region, but the nice history of the Talas battle is, of course, a very easy way of remembering where and when things happen. It's so at the beginning of the 8th century that paper makes its appearance into the Islamic world. How can you produce paper? You can use raw fibers, and this is the Chinese method, using the bark of the mulberry tree to make paper. Or second possibility, you collect used clothes or ropes or any kind of product with this kind of fibers, hemp, linen, jute, and you cut it into small parts and you beat it, either the raw materials or the fibers, in order to make a pulp, which will become white if you clean it with chalk. If you use, for example, old clothes, of course, if you use it directly, you will get something which will be brownish and dirty. But you have to put it into the chalk in order to eliminate the colorant, and it will be white in the end if you do that properly. Then, of course, you have the pulp, which is what you need to produce sheets of paper. But to convert the pulp into sheets, you have to use a mold like this one. And this is the first technique, the most the easiest, which doesn't require a lot of expertise to produce paper. You see, there is a frame in wood, and of course you don't see that very clearly, but the bottom is just there are a lot of fibers which make like a screen, which will keep the fibers the lady is pouring into the mold, and the water will be eliminated when she will take this out of the water and put it on the side in order to let it dry. And you see here the sheets which are already made. They are not completely ready because they are still wet, but they are ready, and these will be the sheets of paper. This method is a very simple one. It's very archaic. It has only one drawback. If you want to produce 500 sheets of paper, you need, of course, 500 molds, which means a lot of investment. If you are in a hurry, this is a problem. If you can wait, you can produce every day 10 leaves. Wait until the next one. If the sun helps, the paper will dry, and you can use again your molds. But of course, people became aware of the drawback of this method and turned to another, well, I will drop for this, which doesn't help a lot. This is purely, and managed to invent another way of producing paper. In this case, you have to prepare the bottom of the mold with this kind of plants, which are rather firm and will give you the kind of screen which will eliminate the water and keep the fibers of the paste. So it's vegetal, and then it's prepared in such a way that you will get, like a textile, rows of horizontal fibers which are held together with threads. Usually it's horses' hairs which are used for this because it's thin and very strong. And this can be taken away or put onto this wooden frame behind, which will support the screen when it's dipped into the paste in order to produce a sheet of paper. Here we will follow the process of traditional paper making. The photographs were taken in India in the 80s. Of course, it's not exactly the way in which paper was produced in the Middle Ages, but it gives you an idea of the way in which it was done. So here, first step, the man is moving the paste. The fibers tend to fall into the bottom of this vat. So in order to produce good paper, you have to have an homogeneous amount of fibers into the vat. So you have to move it regularly. And then, well, it's another picture. The paste has been tinted into orange, so it's not the normal paste which will look white, but nevertheless. So first step is moving the paste in the vat and preparing his mold before he dips it into the water. Here is a very important moment because you have to go into the water, making a movement which will allow the fiber to distribute evenly on the bottom of the frame. He will take it out of the vat, and here you see the moment when he will separate the bottom, the screen, from the leaf, which will come on top of the leaves which has been prepared previously and are waiting here. So you see that with only one frame and one screen, you can produce a large number of sheets in a continuous manner. And so this is the point in which this technique, which was diffused very largely in the Islamic world, made the difference with the older technique of the rigid frame, which was later only used for specific purposes. So he lays his sheet on top of the other leaves already prepared and puts on top of it a piece of linen. If he didn't do that, he would get some cardboard because, of course, the leaves would glue together and produce a very thick cardboard, which would be unusable for writing, for example. And when he's finished with the paste which was prepared in the vat, he just put on top of it a board of wood and some heavy stones on it in order to press the water out of the paper in order to accelerate the drying of the sheets. Then the next step is to separate the sheets and put them either on a wall, as it is the case here. So here we see the end of the process. The paper had been put onto the wall, and when it's dry, the lady is taking away the leaves, and it happens, well, I've seen that in some manuscript, some pages with some grains of sand coming from the cement on which it was applied. The other way, but I'm not sure that it was used in that way in the Middle Ages, is to treat it as a laundry. So you put the sheets like that and you let them dry. Of course, once you have the sheets of paper, you cannot write directly on them. It's actually, it would be just impossible because the ink would go in every direction. You have to use a preparation with which is usually done with rice or wheat, boiled during a long time in water until you get a white preparation, which the lady is taking with this piece of linen and puts it onto the sheet which is prepared in order to make it waterproof, actually. So you have to do that on both sides. And as you know, in the Islamic tradition, people like very glossy papers. So you have, even after that, to burnish the paper with a special stone. Here, well, you see even that he's using a special wooden stand in order to put the paper and rub it gently with a very hard stone. And you get this kind of paper. You see that it's shiny because it has been extensively burnished. The only case in which the old technique of rigid frame, which I was showing as the first slide of my previous presentation of paper, is used, is when it comes to produce large sheets of paper. Because the technique we have seen previously, that one, cannot allow the production of large sheets of paper. One, because of course what you can take with your hands has a limitation, and your own experience certainly has shown you that when you try to take something out of water, it's very heavy. So you have to make a considerable effort to take it out. So it doesn't work. This technique is good when you produce paper traditionally for, let's say, small to medium-sized sheets of paper. But if you want to produce larger sheets of paper, you still have to use this old technique of the rigid frame, in which you put the paste into the floating mold until it's distributed evenly in the mold in order to get a large sheet of paper. In this case, of course, two persons will go together and take the mold out of the water. The technique of paper making started in Central Asia, was diffused in the Islamic world slowly until it reached Muslim Spain in the probably 10th or early 11th century. And it reached the city of Játiva in southern Spain. And here the technique was taken over in Europe and developed in another direction by the Italians, and especially in Fabriano, where the basic tools we have seen were further refined using new techniques which became available at that time. First, the use of metallic wire instead of vegetal components to produce the screen. And second, the water power. What was not possible in the Islamic world for climate reasons became possible in Italy, for example, and water was used, for example, to beat the linen which was used for the preparation of the paste. And of course, the result became so much better that it completely replaced traditional paper in the Islamic world, first in North Africa. We see the first Western paper in Arabic manuscript written in southern Spain or northern Africa by the end of the 13th century, and slowly it reached the eastern part of the Mediterranean. The difference between the two papers is mainly a technical one. The frame is no longer made with the vegetal thread and looks very regular, because it's you see that when you are using fibers, you get this kind of thing. A fiber, I will exaggerate here, but a fiber will look, well, sorry, it doesn't. Well, a fiber is thicker at the bottom and thinner at the top. So if you put all the fibers side by side, of course, you will start like this, but progressively you will make a circle. So you have to alternate fibers, have some in this direction and the other ones. Thank you. So typically, so fiber will look like that, and in order to get the mold as regular as possible, you will have to put them in this way in order to get things even. With a metallic thread, of course, you just have to put the threads one next to the other, and they will look very parallel. The second difference will be with the screen itself. You see that in the Islamic world you have the screen like that, and you have a wooden element which looks like that, and this one comes on top of the wooden structure, but you can separate both. In the Italian technique, the two will be together in this way. There will be the screen like that, and the wooden part will be maintained with a hinge like that. So you can leave it, but it's more coherent. And then you have a wooden element which comes on top of it, which will help producing, we'll see that in a second, help producing neat limits to the sheet. The traditional paper, as you perhaps noticed on the slides, doesn't look as a neatly cut sheet of paper. It has to be cut later. With the technique which will be developed in Italy, you will have from the start a page of a sheet of a certain dimension. We go quickly through the process. So here is the linen cut into small parts with this kind of tool. Here, as I said, is the water mill which will beat the paste. You see these elements go up and down and beat it completely. Here you have a look at the paste while being prepared. And here, well, it's also some kind of folkloric presentation of medieval paper making, so don't imagine that it's taken in the Middle Ages. So two persons are working, and this is also important in traditional Western paper making. You have two persons, one who is taking the paste out of the vat, and the other one who receives the mold with the sheet of paper and puts it on top of the prepared pages. This is important because actually another difference in Western papermaking is that you are using two molds. That is to say that this man takes the paste while the other one lays the sheet on top of the others, then gives back the empty mold to the first one, who meanwhile has been preparing the next sheet. So the rhythm of production is more important. So here we see the man and dipping the mold into the paper vat. He takes it out, making this movement which will help putting the paste even on the bottom of the mold. And here you see this element I was describing to you, which moves and is taken away. And from the start, as you can see, you have a neatly defined sheet of paper. Well, here they are working together. And after that, the sheet of paper is put on top of felt, which will help with this kind of press to eliminate the water more quickly and to dry it. And later, you will have to rub the sheet as we have seen in the East in order to make it waterproof and ready for use by the copyist. Of course, the history for us doesn't stop here. Because manuscripts were produced in the Islamic world until today, actually. But there were a lot of manuscripts produced in the 19th century, which were using another kind of paper, which I will not present as in detail as the two other varieties of paper, the industrial paper produced according to new techniques. We have seen that the traditional Eastern paper and the Western papers were produced with molds, which were producing sheets. In the 19th century, well, by the end of the 18th, actually, people invented a new machine which produced a roll of paper. That is to say that this element was going into the vat, taking the paste out, and the paper was coming as a roll. Of course, it was cut later, but the interruption between the moments when the mold was put into the paste was eliminated in order to accelerate the rhythm of production. So this kind of machine made paper even cheaper, and the more so that in the meantime chemistry made some progress. I told you that before paper was produced and made white with a chalk. By the end of the 18th century, people discovered that it's possible to whiten it with chlorine, and this will lead, of course, to a new development. We will get whiter papers, and we will also have machines to dry the paper. And last step, people discovered that it was possible to make paper with wood, and this, of course, changes completely the picture, because from that moment, paper doesn't anymore depend on the collection of old linen. It becomes completely autonomous. Wood is transformed into paper, with many problems. If you look at manuscripts which were produced during the 19th century with these new techniques, they tend to turn into dust, because between chlorine, wood, and so on, there was no control over the chemistry of the paper. It was too acid, and it was actually meant to disappear at a moment. And actually, it's very difficult to keep these manuscripts because they tend to crumble and disappear. So this was a quick presentation of paper. If you have any question, I may perhaps answer.
Yes? When was the first time paper started to be made of wood?
Paper, well, is used for the production of books in China. Well, we leave alone China because it's another history. For the Islamic world, the oldest book written on paper we know today is dated to the middle of the 9th century, around 850. So it's, but there were perhaps before other books, but they have not been preserved. Paper is not used all of a sudden everywhere. Of course, the first examples we have come from the eastern part of the Islamic world. In North Africa, for example, parchment stays on a little bit longer. And there is also a difference between, let's say, lay text and the Quran. The Quran is written on parchment until the 10th century. There is some kind of mistrust of the paper. People don't know if it will last for a long time. And so they tend to favor parchment, which was better known for texts as the Quran or Hadith, because they know that there will be no problem of keeping it for a very long time.
My question actually was, when was the first paper made of wood?
Wood, excuse me, I didn't catch. Well, wood, the first experiments are at the beginning of the 19th century. People tried a lot of solutions because at that moment everybody knew that the old paper produced with old linen was not answering the needs. For example, the printing, the papers which were published needed a lot of paper. So they were looking for various solutions, and in Germany they discovered that wood was the best component one could use. No other questions? Okay.
Sorry, which one is better for calligraphy or decoration, parchment or classical?
Well, between let's say traditional and modern paper, of course, the difference is more a matter of preparation and technique. Parchment is very different because it's completely different. It's the kind of well, you are working with something which is already, let's say, with its grain and so on. There will always be in parchment a difference between the hair and flesh sides. The hair side, that is to say, well, the outside part of the parchment will be smoother for the pen than the hair side. And this cannot be eliminated. Paper, on the other hand, can be more manipulated with the starch you put on it, or egg white, or this kind of thing. And then, of course, there is the technique of the calligrapher.
Sorry, is it possible actually if you give us some very little information about parchment, while we have not so much examples here?
Well, it's easy. I go back to the beginning of my. No. I just suppose it was boring for you because you were dealing more with paper manuscript. But of course, papyrus also has been used in the Islamic world, but we don't have codices. We have only pieces of codices written on papyrus. A vegetable fiber with two different sides, because on one side you have vertical lines and the other one is horizontal. So there is one side on which you write very smoothly, and the other one you have to struggle with the fibers. So parchment. Well, parchment, of course, was also known when Islam appeared. Well, you know that the name of the parchment has to do with the Bergama, because it's said that it was there in Hellenistic times that parchment was invented, because the rulers of Egypt at the moment were in war with Pergamon, and decided to make a blockade on the exportation of papyrus, and so people had to use another support for their writing. The story is a little bit more complicated. You know, there's a lot of nice histories, but the historic truth is a little bit different. The first manuscripts we have, and they can be dated to the second half of the 7th century, like these manuscripts, are Qurans. Quranic manuscripts were at first written on parchment, like this one. What is typical of parchment is that it's made with skins. Actually, it's a matter of decision. If you want shoes, you won't have books. If you want books, you won't have shoes, because the same skin can be transformed either into parchment or into leather. But the process is slightly different, and the parchment cannot be used for anything. Well, it can be used as a window panel or for books, but not for anything else. There is a big difference between the two sides of the skin. Of course, when the craftsman gets the skin, first things he does is to eliminate what is not useful for the parchment. That is to say, the hair. So once again we have the chalk. You soak the skin into lime, and this is also used at that period by ladies to eliminate unwanted hair. You put the skin into chalk with water, and you remove the hair. So if the work is done properly, you will only have the traces of the hairs. If, as is the case here, you don't do this properly, you will have some elements which will remind you that this was a skin. It's particularly evident when it comes to the part of the skin which is located at the juncture between the legs of the animal and the body. Typically, it will look, well, a skin looks more or less like that. So the places which are located here have a different kind of implantation of the hair, and you will have this kind of situation where you see very clearly the dots. And the best manuscripts usually tend to avoid these places. Typically, they will, as much as possible, cut into the central part of the parchment in order to get the best quality. But of course, if you do that, you lose a lot of material, which actually is reused by other people who don't care for the appearance. On the other, well, the hair side usually is yellower than the flesh side. The flesh side, as you will see here, is whiter. And also, if you touch it if you rub it with the finger, the hair side is smoother than the flesh side. Of course, if you are trying to investigate parchment in the library and start to do that, usually librarians come and wonder what you are doing, stroking the book in this very strange way. On the flesh side, there is another thing which will be sometimes visible, this kind of traces, which are due to the fact that when scraping the meat and the fat of the animal, the craftsman will not control his blade, and it will jump, and it will leave this kind of trace. Here you have another example, and you see that it's just that when doing that, the instrument jumped from one place to another and left these ugly things. The parchment is also characterized by these natural limits. I mean that, for example, in this manuscript, it's a text which was transcribed in the 10th century in North Africa. People didn't want to eliminate too much parchment, so instead of cutting the sheet like that, they cut it like that. And so you have here the border of the skin which appears, and you can see that it's also a place where it's more difficult to eliminate the hair because you cannot scratch it as easily as in the center. So you will have this kind of situation, and you see that on the next folio, this is the recto of folio, let's say 1. This is a recto of folio 2. Here we have a sheet which has been, it's a bifolium. It has been folded like that. So here you have the hair side, but here, of course, you have the flesh side. So what you see on the picture is this part, and you recognize this element of the skin. The border of the skin may also appear in the margins. Here, for example, you have in the same manuscript a place where this element is visible. These are not the only things which can be found on parchment. It happens during the life of an animal that it is, for example, hurt by anything, and it will have some trace on the skin which will be preserved, and on that spot the skin is thinner, and will when the parchment is prepared, it will be enlarged. When you prepare parchment, basically you do this. You take the skin like that. Well, you have a kind of frame. You put the skin of the animal like that, and you will stretch it as much as possible, and during this process, all this kind of spots which are thinner will open. And this happened in this manuscript. So there were two injuries which remained and created this kind of thing. The copyist of the manuscript found a solution to keep using all the manuscript as possible. Of course, on the recto, you see that his line stops here because there is a hole. But he used a very thin parchment, which is known as gold beater parchment, which is used for the preparation of gold leaf, which is much thinner than the kind of parchment which is used for books because it's too thin to be written on. And on the verso, you have the same place. You note here the two holes, but of course he was able to write above because there was a kind of patch which was stuck just in the right place. I've shown examples of nice looking manuscript, but of course for students' copies as this manuscript also from Northern Africa, sometimes you find this kind of situation. It's not that a part of the page has been torn away later. It's just that from the start, it was reused. Once again, you have to think that books were expensive, and everything was good to spare material as much as possible. Another example. Parchment was, as paper, able to be dyed, and there is a very good example, very famous, the Blue Quran, which was dyed into blue. But we have also examples of yellow parchment, of pink parchment, which apparently was an imitation of Byzantine ways of using parchment. Parchment could also be reused, and this is what is called a palimpsest, where you have various levels of script. Here it's a very famous example from Sana, where you have the old scripts below. It has been erased, and over another scribe wrote another text on top of it. Parchment is very resistant. You can actually children were using parchment for their in school to write the lesson with the master, and then they could wash the parchment and take the ink away before reusing it on the next day. But this was only possible if you were using carbon ink. If you were using, as is the case here, you were using metallogallic ink, that is to say an ink which is a mixture between metallic salt and gold nuts, then it was not possible because it went deep into the parchment, and to erase the script, as was the case here, you had to rub it a lot before eliminating the first scripts. Parchment has been used until the 10th century on a regular basis in the East, but in North Africa it remained in use until the 14th and perhaps even beginning of the 15th century for the copy of the Quran. It was something very specific, and also for Hadith. But for other books, North African were also using paper. It's interesting to know that we have some examples of books which are made of parchment and paper. Once again, people were not confident that paper would last forever. So we have many examples of quires, of mixed quires. That is to say that the copyist would prepare a quire with the outer bifolium in parchment. Then he would put three leaves of 3 bifolio of paper, and in the center another bifolium of parchment. So it will have a protection from the outside and from the center, because of course here was the thread which was used to sew the book, and it would not cut the parchment, whereas it was possible that this would damage the paper. This kind of situation is a little bit exceptional, as is exceptional the use of parchment at a later date. We have examples from Ottoman Turkey of small books written on parchment, but it's not exactly, it's more let's say the gold beater parchment I've shown previously, and also in India. We have examples of prior books from India written on parchment, but there are more, let's say, exceptional items as the kind of book which was produced on a regular basis. You're welcome. Okay, so we'll have a break.